So thank you everyone for joining. Like we talked last time, this is an ad hoc session on Wednesday. Typically it's on Monday, so we'll revert back to the original schedule starting the next session onwards. In terms of updates, Sana, great to have you as the chair of this community. Very excited and look forward to working closely with you. Perhaps you could share your few words of wisdom with the group.
Sounds perfect, Kaushik. Thank you. I'm very excited to work with Kaushik alongside with the rest of the community members on this SIG group. I see there is a lot of participation and already a lot of new requests are coming for sharing additional ideas on shaping the requirements and user stories and roadmaps. So it seems to be a very exciting time in this project where we have a lot of opportunity to shape things. And Kaushik and I had one meeting yesterday, and we are going to align the structure and requirements for immediate focus for the phase one, user stories V1. And going after forward, we will be continuing to get additional feedback on user stories and requirements from the community, and especially telcos, to ensure that everybody's voice is heard in our requirements going forward. So as we go along in today's session, I will try to give some additional thoughts on the next meeting session and what we are doing there, and how to cater for the topics that are coming in request for presenting and working through the session. So I'll give it back to Kaushik and let him finish.
Perfect. Thank you, Sana. Again, welcome, and we'll lean on your leadership and support for anchoring, especially in the early days of this community, and make sure you can help provide the right level of structure and rigor to this group.
Sounds perfect, Kaushik.
Yeah. So with that, I did update the agenda. I don't know if people had other topics that were, I did not see anyone else adding topics. And I forget if there were additional topics from the past that we had agreed to pursue in this session. But regardless, Sana, there was one topic, I believe you added this, where you wanted to discuss from the telco side what the challenges lie in terms of automation, and hence what should be the short-term, long-term priorities and focus.
That's right.
Uh,
Kaushik, that's a topic that I wanted to consider for the next meeting.
I
Maybe
see.
this is a very high time we discuss that. And I also had a proposal. I don't know if it's a good time to bring it up as you have the agenda items in front of you. Something that we have done internally for our internal similar meetings, we create an Excel sheet kind of document where we create the agenda topics and we allow the people to vote for the topics. And as a topic gets higher number of votes, we try to bump it up in the priority level, and we organize our flow on the series of the meetings. Um, I received another presentation request this morning. John connected me, and I felt as if more and more people are interested in sharing something and bringing something to the community. We could use that tracker to organize ourselves around how we are taking in presentations and additional ideas from everyone, and how the agenda is forming for every session that way.
Yeah, and that's a great suggestion. John, let's pursue this internally and figure out how we can execute on such a process.
Yeah, sounds good. I will share you a Google Drive internally that we are using just for the sake of template. And if that's something we can use for this forum, maybe that will be very helpful.
Perfect.
Sounds good.
That's great. So I had one topic which, based on the user stories that Google had shared with the community, probably just walk through the user stories with the group. It was great to receive the kind of feedback that many of you had presented. We did update some of the user stories based on those comments. There are some comments that need further discussion. How about we spend 10-15 minutes talking through it? I will also give my color on how we came about those user stories and why we thought it would be it's a useful way to anchor the discussions. We are extremely open to, especially for telcos, to provide your inputs. Uh, would that be a good 15 minutes worth of time? I assume that's a yes.
Sure.
Yes,
Yes.
sounds good, Koshak.
Hey, so first of all, just a little bit of caveat. The ordered process that we had discussed, I believe last SIG, was we should agree and document the design principles and design goals for Nephio. That's step number one. Falling from those design principles, we should define the user stories and scope for V1, uh, right? Which is what this document is trying to do. And then that would be step two, but then community has to all come together, which is, and step two is where I'm looking at Sana, you and the telcos to help define the requirements for V1, with all of us contributing and providing our support. And step three is the architecture, which driving from those user stories and the scope for V1, we should agree on a Nephio V1 architecture so that it just becomes a logical waterfall model. We start from the top level design guidelines, we then drive down to user stories, and then we drive down to architecture. And then, of course, step four is the implementation. From a timeline standpoint, the way envisage this to shape out, especially its early days, we should strive to make quicker progress. I would propose a 6-month timeline. And Sana, this is where you and I will need to work together cohesively to figure out what how we should project manage this in the rightful way. But I would roughballing. I would say we should put the scope in a way that allows us to achieve the V1 implementation in about 6-month timeline. And then beyond that, we can figure out how to, create a roadmap and create, further revisions and so forth, right? So that's the overall theme of how I am personally approaching this. And I will work with some of you community members to help define, help shape up this project plan.
Yeah,
Again,
Kaushik, give me one. Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, go ahead, Sana.
Yeah, give me another. I want to understand one more thing. So when we finalize the user stories for Nephio V1, is it sequential that the automation and the other SIG groups would follow the formalized requirements and then start working towards it? I want to understand the interdependencies between the SIG groups, so we can understand how we have to supplement the other groups.
That's a great point, and this is where John, you and I should, given you have been also been involved in the other six, we should figure out a common theme to tie these six because I would want no duplication of work in terms of guidelines and user stories across these six, right? That should be a common theme, and we should then bring those together and then fall from those into each of the six, goalposts. So this SIG would do architecture, the other six would do automation, and so forth. But the user stories and so forth should be common. So let's figure out a model or mechanics of how to achieve that.
And is there a way, Kaushik, that at least the chairs and the co-chairs should sync up monthly or bi-weekly between the SIG groups so that we can align on what we discussed and what we agreed on, or what is our short-term goal, what are our deliverables, and is it a way? Is there a way that our deliverables become an input for the automation group, or the automation group has their own focus independent of us? Which I don't think so, right? It has to take a feedback from us to make their objectives and plans.
Yeah, so we have plans around sort of platform level support, but we really need these inputs from this group, including both the use cases and the specific functionality and scope that we're going to achieve, and also even furthermore, like information model type of things. So I see it within the scope of SIG automation to do the sort of detailed design of the actual CRD APIs, but the information content of those and the logical model is something I'm hoping to see out of this group, because really this group is where the primary telco knowledge is housed.
That sounds good, John. And I can see Tall Liron is here as well from the other SIG group. So this is good that people are represented across different SIG groups who can actually exchange the information, knowledge, and update. And it's great that you have attended all the other SIG sessions as well. So that solves the problem that I was asking for.
Yeah, though Sana, we should have anchor point for a recurring meeting between chairs and vice chairs of the various SIGs so that it's an ongoing exercise to stay connected.
That's right, Kaushik.
Yeah, I will take that AI and follow through, John, with you and Kandan and so forth. Okay.
Okay.
So with that caveat and or rather with that understanding of the logical sequencing of steps, this was somewhat of a, I would say, opinionated view to seed thoughts into the community about how we should pursue the V1 user stories. Uh, Somewhat of without having agreed to. Hey, Fabrizio, go ahead. You're in mute if you're speaking. Did you mean to raise your hand, Fabrizio?
I think he did by mistake because
Yeah.
I did absolutely by mistake. Sorry for that.
no worries.
I'm working with my phone in my hand, so that's the reason why.
That's
Sorry.
okay. No problem. No problem. Okay. So from Google standpoint, they wanted to, like I said, seed some thoughts into the community. I understand we have, as a community, not anchored on specific design principles and goals. In some way, the design principles of Nephio have been out there in terms of early engagement with all of you, but we should just consolidate those and put it in a document for everyone's eyes and alignment. We are yet to do that as part of this community. So this is somewhat of a, a step forward without completing the design principles and goals. But regardless, the way we approached this was, let's figure out the set of network functions that are relevant to telecom domain so that we can ground Nephio's architecture in terms of the automation workflows that is more relevant to telecom. So that was the first portion of it. The second portion of it was we wanted to minimize, again, from a scope standpoint, the choice of network functions that we would use, including the testing that we would have to achieve to be able to exercise that automation did work as expected and so forth. So we were looking to figure out, is there something available out there that we could use? Free 5GC just was something that we thought would be easy to both set up, validate, test. It's there are existing tools that we could use it. That was the flavor of how we approached with Free 5GC. The choice of network functions itself, again, we went back and forth. Right now, it says the three NFs are AMF, SMF, UPF. We'd also looked at, I did see some of the comments about, other NFs. We did look at those. Again, it was more driven by scope in terms of meeting a 6-month timeline. We are very happy to look at, hey, should we include UDM and PCF and NRF and other network functions over time? It's a journey, and we should just figure out what's the right scope to achieve in the timelines that we just talked about. So that was the thematic of coming up with the user stories. Before I dig deep into the user stories, any questions on about what we discussed?
So, Kaushik, just curious. So you talked about the design principles. Do you have some sort of a ETA in mind for the community to actually put that together? Because that seems a good input to have for to probably run the use cases, right, against those design principles.
So how about Vishwanath? I don't have an ETA right now, but how about we come up with a plan for a plan sometime this week? And this is something that you, Sana, and we should anchor on internally, and we should propose a plan for a plan, ideally by end of this week or early next. Would that be reasonable?
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe Eric from Orange. Maybe I have some global comments also from experience from other open source community. I think we need to be very cautious about the use case we want to demonstrate, because sometimes we try to do it and we spend a lot of time to, let's say, to solve the networking problem between various CNF to be able to demonstrate an end-to-end use case. So we are not there in Nephio. We are much more on the topic to deliver the automation machinery and so on. So that's why also I think that there was other comments on that topic. So we need to be careful, maybe not let's say delivering let's say sexy demo demonstrating a new use case and so on, but really focusing on the added value that can provide Nephio with regard to existing solution we can find today on the Kubernetes ecosystem or other solution. So for me, it's very important, and we need to be cautious about it because we had a lot of experience on various open source project or internal project where we spend a lot of time, let's say, on the networking issue, try to solve problem between CNF and so on, while it was not, let's say, the focus of the automation. So just a warning, because based on experience, I know we can deviate from our initial objective.
Yeah, Eric, that's a great point, and I'm glad to see your participation here. That's exactly what we are doing in the next session. We are trying to capture the telco's automation requirements and challenges. I will create a draft document so that additional feedback can be received in that ahead of time as well. So once we receive all of that, yeah, of course, Kaushik, this is just an initial proposal from Google.
Sure.
Right, and it's just for brainstorming, and Kaushik is getting additional feedback from the community at this time. I also remember that in our Nephio summit, a half day was dedicated to this by Kandan, and he tried to gather some feedback from the audience at that time, and a lot of people were giving ideas around doing 5G control plane in the beginning, which is why the user story seems to be presenting that at the moment. But of course, what we are doing with these network functions is all in the process of discussion, right, Kaushik?
Yeah,
but I have no problem that to demonstrate a 5G core. It's a good idea, but just try to have in mind that we where the focus should be put on within the Nephio community. That's all. And okay, I can provide also some feedback from what we are doing today internally within Orange and the problem we face when deploying all this 5G core network function in our environment. So maybe I can provide feedback maybe in a dedicated meeting if you want.
Yeah, that would be amazing. You should definitely give us more feedback on what you guys are doing internally. What are your priorities? What are the automation challenges? And what do you expect from Nephio to solve in the short term? And then we'll do it in the long term as well.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Perfect. And Eric, I did see your comments in the doc. Some of them, I did respond. All of them are great inputs. I will make sure I'll respond to all of your comments by end of day. So just proceeding, right? So user story 1 is about deploying or bringing up the 5G core network functions in a cups-like architecture. So the proposal is AMF runs centralized, SMF UPF is disaggregated. Again, these are implementation choices. We can technically also aggregate the SMF along with AMF and just run UPF on the edge. I think as a community, we should make those design choices down the line. This was, like I said, this was driven from the choice of free 5GC and the installation procedure that is outlined on their website. We believe that just these 3 NFs are sufficient to establish a 5G attach. Now, I did say, Vance, your comment about, hey, why should we care about UE demo and end-to-end validation through a real-world scenario? I'm perfectly in line with that approach. The way we thought is there are existing, UE and RAN simulators that can easily establish a call once we have these 3 NFs, automated through Nephio. So we don't need to do additional work to achieve end-to-end automation. And if we are able to get there without significant additional work, just setting up, an existing test tool like Spirent Landslide, or it could be, even potentially free 5GC test tool, that's great, right? If there is, on the other hand, if there's a lot of work to exercise end-to-end UE attach and so forth, yes, we should caution against achieving that as part of a V1 scope. So this is user story one is relatively straightforward. We put some interfaces that should be in scope. The architecture, like I said, looks fairly simplistic. The goal is from a user story standpoint, user journey standpoint, to ensure that, hey, most telcos are in their 5G deployment life cycle, both deploying early 5G clusters and are scaling their 5G deploys. So this would help mimic a scenario where how do we automate that? Now, what this doesn't do in this document is figure out the specifics of design, like how should intent be specified, at what level of granularity should intent be specified, like how much does network planning factor into the inputs, how does the operator framework look like all of those are open questions that, again, based on the design goals and the use cases, we should then define as part of the network architecture for V1. This document is not a network architecture talk. This is just merely, ignore the diagrams here for a second. This is merely trying to put English words into what we think would be credible or reasonable user stories to achieve for. The one thing of notice would be we suggest that automating of the cluster creation itself should not be in scope for V1. We'll get there in a future iteration, but we should automate the installation of the software on individual nodes like CNI plugins and so forth that as needed by the network functions. Somebody has a hand, Tal.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's been a few minutes ago, so we might have lost the moment, but it's still an important point. I'll add, I really liked Eric's comment from before. I want to emphasize, maybe again with connection to SIG automation, that look, we can draw diagrams and create a use case that we think is ideal, but we're limited by what exists in open source. So I'll take you back to Jose's presentation that he gave about showing what exists in open source and what works. What I would suggest, I will suggest in the meeting of SIG automation coming up, is that we start bundling these things into Kubernetes, just making sure all the open source components are available for us to use. But in the end, the use case will be based on the functionality that exists there. It's limited. It's not great. We're not going to be able to create a commercial grade 5G system. So, but who cares, right? The point here really is the delivery mechanisms, right? And what Nephio does. So again, I know Eric said exactly the same thing, but I'm agreeing 100% that let's focus on the automation parts, and the components are kind of what we have. We don't have a lot of choice. Beggars can't be choosers. And that's it.
That's a good point, Tal.
Yeah.
See, Ravi's hand. Ravi?
Hi, Kaushik. Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to understand, you kind of mentioned about the 6 months timeline. Timeline primarily is a function of what you want to achieve, right? So how do you, I mean, what was the kind of the rationale behind setting this timeline?
Again, this is not first caveat, is this is not something that we as a community have agreed to. This is somewhat of my personal opinion of trying to time bound initial implementation so that the community can stay anchored and focused. I choose 6 months because that seemed reasonable to me, and I was almost suggesting we can work backwards from that timeline in terms of figuring out the scope and design and so forth. There is also an alternate approach where we say, hey, this is really what we want to achieve in V1, and we'll then sort out what the time that it takes to do it, right? Just given where we are in terms of sophistication of Nephio 6 and so forth, I worry the latter approach might lead to more threshing and more confusion and delays in terms of achieving something credible, right? So hence I was more thinking or more in line with the former approach, but it is really up to, like, especially this was pre vice, I was just acting in my vice chair capacity, but especially now that Sana, you are here, I would also lean on you to make sure we have a consistent way to approach and set timelines and a project plan for the community to achieve towards.
That sounds perfect, Kaushik. Ravi, I agree with Kaushik. It's an initial target, so we can at least find the short-term goals and we can focus on them, and we can also continue to look at the long-term picture in parallel. We need to look at something achievable, tangible in the V1. So 6 months is completely tentative at the moment. We'll see in next few meetings how much time are we taking in finalizing the scope and the requirements for V1. You can see there are a lot of curiosity from the group on finalizing even the user stories at the moment. So if you're taking longer, we'll reconsider the timeline. But initial target, I would stick with Kaushik's recommendation of 6 months for this time. We can see if we need to change that, right?
Yeah, no, basically because in the absence of anything like an architecture or a use case document, because you need to fundamentally even kind of pin down the actual functional components and drive a use case scenario saying that how things are going to be from an end-to-end perspective. So without having all that view, to even basically this is also kind of probably it's being too proactive, and we had one similar document for VRAN and stuff like that, but to kind of pin down timelines without that complete view, and it seems to be kind of a little bit kind of difficult to understand exactly how you might be what you plan to achieve at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, we get your point. Let's assess the timeline in a couple of next sessions. I think we're all ramping up to this, and we have taken the feedback. If 6 months looks too ambitious, as we said, we will revise that, right, based on everyone's view and feedback. I have one follow-up question to Tol before we can get to you, Prakash. Tol, it's very important that you shared your feedback on the existing state of what exists in Nephio today, and I wanted to understand a little bit more from your perspective. Did you feel that the AMF, UPF, SMF use case that we are initially proposing for the V1, does that seem ambitious to you, or what is it that you tried to basically say in beggars can't be choosers? Like, I wanted to understand the state today and where we are.
Oh, I think we're okay. I think that these things are doable. But I think that there's always an appetite to go more and deeper. The more comments people say, well, what about this? Well, what about also this scenario? Well, I suggest we keep it as high level as we can, because we're going to find out things that work and don't work. Some of these open source projects we're dealing with have single developers, right? They're, they do what they can do. That's what I mean by beggars can't be choosers. We're not going to be able to actually develop 5G components here together, and that's not our goal. So we're using things that are off the shelf, that are upstream, that have mixed quality, mixed support. I think they're going to be good enough. In our demo,
this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's just it. I'm just reiterating.
Okay, so the 5GC core is an open source 5G core. It already exists. All the documentation is already available. I think in a lot of my internal demos when I was working with automation, this used to be our go-to network function because it's open source. We don't have to work through the compliance and licensing requirements and get the vendor support and getting some proprietary information which requires NDA. So that was a perfect candidate for attempting to do in the phase 1 because everything is open source. This in itself is an open source, I think, solution.
Yeah, exactly, Sana. And I'll just chime in and just to give a little context. About a month ago, maybe, Tal, one of Tal's colleagues at Red Hat, did a presentation. They actually did a sort of exploration of all the different open source projects available for network functions, and as well as the sort of underpinnings, things like that we need in Kubernetes. So that and I guess from what Tal just said, I think we're okay with the current choice, and it sounds like your experience is similar. We're okay with the current choice, and just as has been stated by several folks here, like the goal of this is to exercise and identify and complete pieces of the automation functionality, and the actual network functions themselves eventually will be implemented by commercial vendors using that infrastructure, but we just need a way to prove out that infrastructure.
Yeah, so to put it a little more on that, free 5GC particularly, it's obviously there's the Kubernetes Helm charts and manifests already existing, and then there are well-documented ways of how you set up a 5G call using UE RAN SIM. So this is actually, for us, so far for our investigation, this is probably a very good choice.
Yeah, and Stephen, I have already automated the free 5GC core using traditional information models and Helm charts. So I know all the documentation exists today. If that don't exist, even we have it. And it's free, and it's no vendors involved in that, so we can always share in the community. So the translation here would be to develop operators for this, and it's going to be not a lot of work. I do believe that it's going to be an achievable target for us. If that gives a little bit more context to all, we're not standing up a full 5G core, but it's going to be the first attempt in attempting to do it with an FU way.
Yes, the core is relatively the easy part. It's when we go beyond the core that things are going to get stickier, I believe.
Oh yeah. The complexities in the 5G and expectations from 5G as we extend this into more ambitious use cases, of course, there is a lot more that is down the road. So we need to look at the people who have raised hands. I think Prakash, Ravi, Bernard, you all have raised hands. Please go ahead and ask your questions in the order you raised hands.
Yeah. Can I speak now? Prakash,
yes, go ahead, Prakash.
You're able to hear me. Okay. So one way to put that, okay, except saying that beggars are not choosers, I would say that if you look at what options are available, then only you know whether you are a beggar or not. So I don't agree with that term here. First of all, you need to tabulate saying that, okay, 5G core has this, OAI has this, Magma has this, you've got different cores available in different ways. So a exercise in that would be worth looking at, one. Second, so this is, we are focused right now on 5G core automation alone. We are not getting into anything on the transport or on the RAN side of it. That is the assumption currently. If the assumption is going to change, or at least in the long term, we do have to look at what is the transport and what is the networking associated, and accordingly also what the radio and how do we do end-to-end in the long term. Because if 5G core is what you want to automate, this is already automated by several people. It's the cloud native aspect of it is one, which is exciting for us to be part of Nephio. And same way we will look forward to further roadmaps so that we can include those as a what you call a deliberated way of knowing that we have understood it and then we are going after it. Thank you. That's all.
Okay, from my point of view, I just want to mention that sort of for us, it's not interesting to simply be able to sort of make use of an operator concept to somehow onboard a free 5GC on top of a Kubernetes cluster. This is a task which sort of normal developers are capable of doing, of creating sort of such an operator. Our concern is that sort of we are possibly having to introduce sort of these old-fashioned element management systems with a variety of implementation options, with a variety of integration issues, which would then make our lives very complicated as soon as we have to mix and match those network functions with different cloud infrastructures, mix and match them sort of, for instance, the UDM, UDR coming from a different vendor with sort of AMF, UPF, SMF coming from another vendor. So what we are really interested in is establishing best practices, principles of how automation should work, how to properly structure CRDs, how to sort of establish sort of intercommunication, for instance, between operators or controllers in order to facilitate the life cycle of those network functions. So all those discussions about sort of is free 5GC okay or not is, from me, sort of then sort of relevant when we can link them to the principles which we would like to demonstrate. That means ideally we have sort of some kind of guideline saying this is how you would structure the CRDs, and then we then show that how we would do that with the help of the free 5GC.
Yeah, but Bernard, to your point, the struggles with the EMSs and the automations and how the automation becomes very complex when you're trying to work with the hybrid multi-vendor environments on different types of infrastructures. That is exactly what we need to show that Nephio can solve eventually. We have the guiding principles, and Kaushik talked about in the beginning. We also have the 12-factor apps for the CNFs, and there was on the Nephio website, there was a blog that myself and Kandan and Abdul published, which exactly talks about the challenges associated with the network functions. So the transformation that Nephio is hoping to bring about is not just the automation paradigm, but to also influence the CNFs from different types of vendors to change their models and designs to adapt to those principles. Eventually, we will start to see the ecosystem gradually moving towards this more cloud native vision. And to John's point, we had to start somewhere, right? And that somewhere is just this. It's the what. You're talking about the how. The how part is already captured in the principles, and we need to reiterate that to ensure that we are on the right track. And when we show the first demo of something working, we will prove again the points that the how was met in the initial goal. And of course, the 5GC core is automated 1,000 times. We have to also differentiate why the operators in CRD's model was different than how it was done before, and how we address the how of that. So this is all coming. It's all a process of this community and its evolution at the moment.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think it's Ravi next.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. So my comment was like on the choice of the open source of the core network functions. I mean, in terms of how representative is it in terms of a typical 5GC deployment by an operator, right? I mean, the idea is that you validate Nephio with this, but then why would operator consider that effort, in any serious context, right? So even in terms of the actual, from a functional perspective, as well as from a dimensioning perspective, exactly if he wants to take that POC and say that, okay, I want to kind of replicate in a certain context for either in the context of, creating a 5G for a private network or for some kind of a dense urban scenario and so on. So, I mean, we should be able to connect those dots. Like, I mean, why is this a valid alternative way of doing things? Considering, as I said, probably these systems are more or less in production. There are probably, I don't know, probably 100, I don't know, numbers of eNode Bs that are there, and 5GC seems to be already virtualized in production networks and all that. So whatever we do should be in considering the reality and saying that, okay, what we are doing is of serious consideration, right?
Yeah, if you don't mind, Sana, I'll take that. I think what Sana said earlier is, fits into this, but this is our exercise of, I think you said, this is a part of the process, right? And part of the exercise here is building something new and identifying what new problems there are to solve. And the specific network functions are sort of like content to feed that process of discovery. And so the particular network functions we choose, in this particular case, free 5GC, yes, may not be particularly challenging and may not impress an operator who would look at it and go, well, I don't care about that, that's stupid. But what it will do is surface the core principles and sort of best practices that Bernard was talking about in a first simple example. Now, then we can take if there are other open source, maybe more complex versions, people are talking about Magma in the chat, I see it flying by, like maybe we can take those and evolve to handling those as well. But even more important is vendors are here and part of our community, and vendors will help us take their commercial products and understand how we can model the configurations and the pieces of those, the management and automation of those more complex and sophisticated network functions. But it has to be an iterative, stepwise process. If we start with the most complex things, we'll become overwhelmed and we'll fail. We'll get. Somebody was saying earlier, I think Eric or somebody was saying, we could easily get bogged down in the details of networking between two CNFs. We don't want to get bogged down in those details. So we want to start with super simple cases, which is why, like in my previous demos, I didn't even start with a network function. Really, I started with a very simple stateless application that has almost no configuration, and that's intentional because I'm trying to iteratively discover the problems we need to solve, and solve them as they come. And so I think that's, to me, the 1.0 goal is not to produce something that's so impressive that people want to put it into production the next day. It's to demonstrate the value. It's to demonstrate the unique proposition and differentiation between existing solutions and Nephio. And if we can't demonstrate that value, maybe we failed. But I think we will be able to demonstrate that value in the simpler case. So that's all.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It was only saying that, to have a reality check on where the industry is. And so whatever we do should be credible and should complement, should raise kind of the envelope.
Okay, yeah, and it should show that differentiation. Otherwise, there's not much point,
Yeah, so we have about 15 minutes. I'll quickly reiterate what I had said earlier, right? I look forward to telcos, especially with Sana as the chair, to help define the requirements and user stories for V1, right? They are the best parties to help define what they are looking for from the initial proof point. So let's wait on that. We'll come back, like I said, with the project plan that we'll share with the community of when we think we can reasonably, meaningfully project that out. Once that happens, I feel the design and so forth scope, we can narrow it down based on the 6-month timeline or whatever we think is reasonable. I think right now there's just too many open avenues, and we're all, as humans, trying to go in many different directions with so much of openness in terms of, where we are. I would like, and Sana, this is where you and I need to help create the discipline and the rigor for this community, so we can somewhat bound our engagement patterns and help drive progress. Because otherwise, without rigor, we all have all great ideas, but then it doesn't help corral the community towards one singular objective, which we can help strive for in a time-bound manner.
Yeah, I completely agree. Kaushik, I think one of the asks from the community is that if we are all agreed on the free 5GC, I was following the chat on the thread along the way, and I think a lot of people have a joint consensus that now the free 5GC might be a good idea to start working with. If that's what we agree on, in the next meeting, we should ask for comments on the how, the user stories on what we are doing with the free 5GC and what do we want to see. So Kaushik, if we have a lot of feedback on that, we'll probably be able to identify the user stories that we can solve in the V1. So we can give everybody a chance to give us additional feedback on what we need to do with the free 5GC. What is it that we want to achieve with? Of course, supplementing all the existing user stories that exist on the document.
Sounds good. Vance?
Yes, but we should pay close attention to what we're hearing from Eric and Bernard and some others. What we need to concentrate on is not being able to instantiate 5GS or some other open source software, not being able to prove we can make a phone call, but to or a session, but to decide on a set of features. And so these use cases should be about the features that make Nephio a unique framework than something else. And we're not giving enough attention to that, in my opinion. Whether it's like really, preferably, we would be choosing a few alternatives. So 5GC, Magma, something else, I don't know. But if we had ideally like 3 different examples of a CNF or a number of CNFs, and we're proving that the framework applies and can be used in each of those, then you've really proven something and learned something. And so that moves the focus on what the platform is delivering. And that's the part of the use case that you should be paying close attention to.
Yeah, Vince, I'll quickly add one comment to what you said. That was exact discussion that I had with Kaushik yesterday. 5G core is already automated. We can deploy that through CNFs, and we have fully automated solutions for the 5G through CI/CD or through the Helm charts or the other information models, and it's already happening. It's in the prime time. We're already in production with that. How do we prove the value that Nephio is doing something different? And that is going to be one of the deliverables of our V1. If we can show that we are deploying this through the Nephio model, we'll also have to prove that why is it different than what we were doing before and how it's giving us a benefit or a value, which will then create the first-hand understanding in the community, in the telco world, in the telco terms, how the configuration is getting simplified and how the automation is becoming simpler and how we are getting more in control of the stateful single view for the infrastructure components as well as the network function components as well as the configuration components within one single pane of glass. How are we trying to get that control on the network function and its life cycle management better through the operators in CRD's model? If we can show that, that will establish the baseline understanding of why Nephio model is relatively better than traditional model and what we are achieving. So that is exactly the goal of the phase 1. We will be definitely focusing a lot on the differences from the existing paradigms and showing the value of why this is better. And we should receive additional feedback like what Vance mentioned in the next meeting to see what do we expect from our V1. Not in the terms of what, in terms of how. What is it that we want to see coming out differently in this exercise, which would enable us to see the difference of Nephio?
Yeah.
Vance, does it answer your question?
Yes, great.
Perfect. Kaushik,
Yeah,
there
go
are
ahead,
more
Randy.
questions. Okay.
Yeah.
I agree with Sana's proposal. I just wanted to suggest that maybe this group can agree on KPIs for this comparison between Nephio and other orchestrators. I say like something like the lines of configuration needed to deploy or the speed of deployment or whatever, but it needs to be, it couldn't be left to the subjective opinion of the users or someone else. So I think it's important to define how this advantage of Nephio will be measured. And I think it's doable. This group just needs to agree on what are the KPIs for this comparison.
Yeah, Rennie, those ideas exist theoretically. So even I have to find a way to prove that. And I think that's the exercise that we are doing in this community to get to that point where we can see it practically working, and we'll have to create the soft KPIs first, and then we see how we can achieve those KPIs through this vision. It's a vision at this point, right? We have to see this in action, actually.
Yeah, but it needs to be agreed by everyone, and maybe KPIs that matter to one operator or one person, another one doesn't care about. So we need to agree on which are the important KPIs.
Yes, I completely agree. And Rennie, you also understand the point that we might be able to achieve those KPIs very easily on a free 5GC because a lot of documentation is available and we have a lot of control. It's an open source project. But when we are trying to do that similar work for the other vendors, we might have a much harder time in achieving that model and achieving those KPIs. So it's a joint collaborative effort that the telcos will have to do with all of our vendors to gradually transform the ecosystem to be able to get to those KPIs. It's an evolutionary process which we need to drive once the value is proven to us, of course. That's where we are.
Yeah.
Back to you, Kaushik.
Yeah, I see Bernard.
So
also
I'll
has a
just make
hand.
it short. Yes. First of all, to add to Rani's comment, I would love to also see KPIs, but first of all, I need to see consistency. That means currently, if we're looking at the process of how we apply those management concepts, for each sort of CNF, we do it differently. And therefore, for me, a foundation would be to have a consistent approach. And then based on that, we can then see if the implementation regarding configuration lines, etc., is okay or not. What I would also like to point out is that in the design principles document, which is already on the Google Drive, sort of I try to bridge this sort of high-level design, describing the situation of telco operators to a sort of a customer journey, describing how telco operators would typically have to manage the life cycle of network solutions. And then related to that customer journey, try to identify typical requirements which would arise in that context. And if Nephio has an interesting way of how to address those requirements, this would be sort of helpful from a telco operator perspective. The user stories would help to demonstrate the way Nephio is addressing these requirements. But I believe ideally we would have to somehow relate in the user stories, sort of saying, if we're saying we're automating the onboarding of a certain network function, this is sort of supporting requirements ABC in the following manner, sort of adhering to best practices as defined by the Nephio community. That would be something which we would love to see here.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bernard. Again, I think all of your voices are loud and clear. We need to really ground this based on relevance to telco's problems. We should also, for each of these user stories, define how Nephio is different, better, put your adjective, and some way that we think some KPIs that can help quantify that differentiation, right? Like, I think I'm happy to take an initial crack for these user stories and help at least put a placeholder of what I think we would want to achieve that is different, better compared to what exists out there, and we can iterate on it. And we will then separately, Sana, you and I should work cohesively to, figure out how should telcos consume some of these proposals and come up with more concrete user journeys for Vivan.
Yeah, sounds good. I think, Kaushik, we still have a lot more questions coming in, and I wanted to spend a few minutes on the next session and ask the community for some feedback. I think we should take Martin's question and then get to that.
Sounds fine. Martin?
Yeah, sorry, just a quick one from my own clarification then is in terms of the CRD formats then for something like 5G core or whatever use case we have on here, is the intention of the project to standardize on the CRD formats across vendors, or for the vendors to submit their own and we have some sort of standardized framework for going and deploying them? Sorry, I'm just a little bit confused about that.
Yeah, I can take that, Martin. So, and it looks like Tal may have a comment too. I expect the goal would be to standardize parts of it, but it has to be vendor extensible. So we have this pattern in Kubernetes CRD APIs and other places. You'll see it with there's different patterns for achieving that goal, but the idea would be that pieces that maybe are shared, especially things that are shared across multiple network functions, which may potentially even come from different vendors, would be in a common CRD Nephio format. And then the vendor extension formats would be completely up to the vendors. They would also be CRDs, but they would be separate CRDs, and they would typically be associated by reference. So similar APIs with similar patterns are like Gateway API in Kubernetes, PVC/storage class in Kubernetes is another pattern where we do similar things. So we can talk more about that maybe in the next call if you want to join, which is in a few minutes.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. That makes sense.
But I think that can be a parallel work also. Maybe we can have an activity just working, trying to, let's say, start maybe defining this CRD, as you said, Vance. I think it's a good idea. But I think this activity may be led in parallel towards the one to define the various use cases. It's also a possibility.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's almost independent of whichever 5G stack is used. You know, if you look at 3GPP, that there should be a set of defined. Well, there is a set of defined parameters, right? That you could use as a starting point for defining the CRDs that should be common across all vendors.
Exactly.
Let me add that I agree 100% with what John said. You know, the DNA has to be, our DNA has to have extensibility built in, right? We really need to think about that all the time. But I'll add, there's another natural extensibility comes from applying the operator pattern, assuming we do. Remember, when in Kubernetes we say operators, we don't always mean we're using the operator pattern. But assuming we do think about it that way, you can chain operators together. So there could be a Nephio upstream operator doing something, but you might have, a vendor might have their operator coming before that and using the Nephio operator as a building block down the chain. So it's all about solutions to real problems. If Nephio solves real things, it'll be used. We're not a standards body, right? We're not creating a set of standards or APIs for vendors to use. We're creating solutions that can be incorporated and make life easier for everybody. That's the hope.
Hey, everyone, in interest of time, Sana, you want to project out what we want to achieve in the next SIG?
Yes, Kaushik, go ahead and supplement with that, okay? So my thought right now is that based on what we received the feedback today, there is a lot of appetite in the group to share their feedback on the user stories so that we can finalize that. How about giving a 5 minutes roundtable to everyone who wants to contribute in the next session? And based on that, we can finalize some of the requirements. That could be one model, or the other model could be that we share a document out, Kaushik, and allow everyone to add their chunk in the document. And then we can review that. That's the feedback we have received from everyone. So everybody who was giving feedback today should provide a concrete recommendation on the user stories by the next session, so that we can incorporate all of that and we can include that in our V1 user story documentation. Kaushik, which model is more productive? Working?
Yeah, I would say, given where we are, I would propose the former, and I would even propose an ad hoc session potentially next week, so that we stay on track and execute fast in terms of alignment.
Okay. So we can send an ad hoc meeting request, and that session, the ad hoc session, will be a live session capturing the request on the user stories recommendations from all those who had some feedback today. Bring in your concrete feedback and incorporate that in a document. Why don't we put a document out there, Kaushik, where people can actually, with their names, add their contributions ahead of time, and when we are in the meeting, we can actually review and consolidate that and allow them to present as well.
Sounds good.
I would like to object a little bit. Currently, we are focusing on user stories for the 5GC, capturing the design principles, coming up with a context in which these aspects are being evaluated, is something which has a different structure and which should be defined independently of the specific user story, because we could also have user stories for other network functions which would follow a similar pattern, which could also demonstrate that. So my concern here is that we're if we are mixing the design principles implicitly within the user stories, we might be missing the point. So I was just wondering if there will be a dedicated document where we capture these principles, capture the requirements, and based on that, then derive what the useful user stories would relate to.
So Bernard, do you want us to capture the requirements independent of the free 5GC in the beginning, just for the sake of brainstorming?
Yes.
We can do that. So let's get the feedback from all the telcos, independent of the free 5GC. What do they expect from Nephio in the short term, in the long term? That's the ask. So let's gather that in the document, maybe focus on that, and then we will extract what we need to do for the free 5GC as a demo use case from that feedback.
I would just like to mention that I've already started capturing that in the design principles document. That means if you look into that document, you will see the situation, the scene, you'll see sort of the basic lifecycle management procedure as a customer journey, and you will see sort of some sort of initial thoughts regarding the requirements which need to be addressed in that context.
Okay, excellent. Bernard, we'll review that. And if that Kaushik, is that document on a shared drive?
It's in the Google
It
Drive.
is, and it is also linked from the meeting notes document that I was sharing earlier.
Okay, and is that editable by other members? So we can also add sections from the other community members to get their feedback into it.
I hope so. Maybe I didn't do that right, but I hope so. Yeah.
Okay, we need to create a version of the document in which we can add additional feedback besides Bernard's requirements. I could insert my feedback into it, and others, Eric and everybody else who had some strong feedback today, could also contribute their thoughts in the same document. And mechanic is John. Let's sync up on the Slack to see how we can achieve that. I'm very new to the tooling we are using. Half time we are using the Linux Foundation tooling, and sometimes we are on the Google.
I know we it's a very messy thing right now, and
it's okay.
We need Linux Foundation to finish some things, but we actually are late for our next call. But so let's wrap this one up. But yeah, we can sync up on Slack on that.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk about it.
I will publish the action items later today, so everyone stays grounded.
Okay, sounds good, Kaushik.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for a lively discussion.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Ah, salut, ça va? Du coup, tu as des slides de prêt, toi, déjà ou... Ah. Tu m'entends, là? Allô? Allô, allô? Ouais, salut.